Business Development Manager here at the London School Group. We're excited to be presenting about navigating British business culture with you this afternoon. We might wait a couple minutes just to let a few more people join us, and then I'll get started with some housekeeping. It's great to see so many people have introduced themselves. We've got a lot of familiar faces and some new names as well. So great to see that we've got attendance from all corners of the globe, from Taiwan to the States, Sweden, Switzerland, France, London, Germany, Japan. So a very international crowd, which is always great to see. Perfect. I think we will get started. So to begin with, just a few things to go over in terms of housekeeping. Just so that everybody is aware, your own microphones are on mute, and just the presenters will be speaking. There are some interaction tools that you can use throughout the presentation and webinar, including raising your hand and typing in the chat function, which I believe many of you are now familiar with. If I could just get everybody to raise their hand for me, if you can hear me loud and clear, that would be great. So we can try out that function. If you could raise your hand if you can hear me all right. Excellent. I believe that's working. And throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to submit those in the chat function. We'll be together for about an hour today, and there will be a Q&A at the end. So feel free to type in your questions throughout, and there'll be the Q&A at the end. And you might also be asked to participate by typing on the slides with the annotation tools. So if everybody, you'll notice on your left-hand side, there should be an annotation box available. The easiest way is to select the T icon and start typing. So if everybody wants to take a stab at trying to type something on this present slide, then we can make sure that we're all set and ready to go. Yep, I see a few people have found the text. If you'd like to type anything, it's the T function, but otherwise the marker will let you scribble and handwrite as well. So you're welcome to try either. Nope. Excellent. So I think most people have located it. And again, type in your questions throughout the webinar and we'll get to them at the Q&A. We will be recording this webinar as well, so feel free to make notes along the way. Otherwise, there will be a link that will be shared later on so that you can go back and look at anything. A quick note as well, we've had some internet issues in the area recently. They seem to have been corrected, but just in case, if you find that the webinar goes out at any point, then Kathy will come back and log in. So if you just sit tight for a few minutes, and in case there are any bigger issues and we're unable to go back, then we will reschedule it. Just a heads up, we don't anticipate having any issues as we've been all right most of today, but just we thought we'd warn you in case we disappear. And with the housekeeping done, I will now hand things over to Kathy. Kathy Wellings is the director of the London School of International Communication, and she will be taking care of you guys today and navigating you through British business culture. Kathy's been in the world of intercultural training for 15 years now. She was born and bred in London, but has lived and worked in France and Spain. And she's got lots of experience working with international clients. Many of them are working with UK clients or partners, and also with helping expats to settle here in the UK. So without further ado, I will pass you over to Kathy's capable hands, and she'll be taking care of you today.
Thanks so much, Faiza, and hello everyone. Thanks again for joining us this afternoon. We're kind of living the British stereotype here today. It's a wet and miserable day, so picture the scene if you're not in London yourself. And it's nice to see some British people on the call as well as people from around the world. So I think one of the things when we talk about our own culture is that we're so immersed in it, we don't necessarily see our own culture objectively. So feel free to disagree with me, to interrupt at any point, because we welcome the richness of the conversation. So we only have now about sort of 50 minutes together, leaving time for the Q&A. So it will be a little bit of a gallop, if you like, through British culture. But let me just show you what I plan to talk about today. I'll give you a little bit of context, a bit of background. But really, I want to get inside some of the values and what makes us tick and how that then impacts on both our social and our business culture, and also talk about how we communicate here. Sometimes we say, I know there's someone from the States on the line, we speak the same language, but we still don't always understand each other. And I think that's where culture comes into play. So I'm going to get you to do some thinking and some text talking to start with. I think, like I said, we see the world and we see our own culture through our own eyes, through our own lenses. And it can be quite interesting to understand how others see us. So I'd like to start by asking you to join the floor and just give me some words. When you think of British people, your British partners, clients, colleagues, what adjectives come to mind? How are the British? What words would you use to describe them? So if you take the T on the left-hand side of your slides and just give me some words, that would be great. Or you can use the text in the chat function as well. Lovely. So no surprises for me here. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with everything, but I think it's words that whenever I ask this question, things like traditional, polite, serious. We've got serious, but we've also got humorous, so that's quite interesting. Tea, nice, very reserved, quiet, indirect. Historical, I guess we have a rich history here. And it has an impact on the way we are today. Reserved, politically correct, indirect. And I think all these words, it depends where you're starting from. We come across as very indirect to countries that have a direct style, like perhaps Germany, Poland, for example. But if we compare ourselves with perhaps countries further afield like Japan or China, we probably sound quite direct. So culture is always a very relative thing. But lovely, thank you for those. I'm going to park them there and we'll see later when I talk about some of the values and some of the ways we work, whether these kind of ideas and words are reflected in the way we do things here. But thank you for that. And I just wanted to share with you a few pictures, really, to give some impressions of the UK. And if you have any thoughts or comments about what these pictures symbolise, then please feel free to put your comments in the chat function. But just to talk you through a few of them, the one on the top left, I don't know if anyone knows where this is, but this is in a street called Brick Lane in East London, which is where many of the Bengali, Bangladeshi community have settled over the years. So it's almost like a mini Bengal. There's lots of restaurants and there's a mosque, and the community is very different to the neighbouring city where all the kind of perhaps traditional men in suits, the banks are. So I think one of the things about the UK is that often the old and the new, the diverse live side by side. The next one is in the southwest of the UK, down in Cornwall, and I choose this because just to show that the sun does shine sometimes here, not very often, but it does shine. More often than not, we have something like the next image, dark, cloudy skies. The next one is in Scotland, as is the one in the bottom right. Does anyone know what the photo in the middle is of? What's happening in that picture? Any ideas? Morris dancers, exactly. So I would say, although we have this image of being a very traditional culture, we have very few traditions that are really lived out today. We don't have the festivals that perhaps other countries have in the same way, but we do have a few things like Morris dancing that you might see in some of the small villages, particularly during the summer. Does anyone know where the bottom middle picture is? It's London, and it's a building we call the walkie-talkie. We've had a real influx of new buildings over the last 10 years, and this is one of the more iconic images I'm sure you've seen in pictures, or perhaps you've been there yourself. There's a really nice restaurant and a terrace you can go to with amazing views of the rest of London. Top right, middle right is Oxford Street, and then bottom left is Chinatown. So, I mean, why am I showing you these pictures? What commonality might you find in this series of images? What does this tell us about the UK? It's diverse. It's very cross-cultural, absolutely. The contrasts, thank you. And I know some of you have probably been in our webinars recently on Japan and Germany, and I think those presenters made the same point that while we talk about national culture, it can be quite dangerous to make stereotypes. Oh, the British are all like this, or the Germans are all this way. Even a very small country like the United Kingdom is diverse. We can see in the images and perhaps from what we know about the country. And while it can be helpful to make some generalizations about British behaviours, British preferences, it's also very important to remember that it's also a culture of contrasts. It's a very diverse country for one so small. And yeah, I think just to kind of summarise, we're an island. You saw some coastal pictures there. And I think a lot of people will describe the UK as quite an insular culture, perhaps quite inward looking. I mean, I don't want to make this session too heavy. I'd like to take a lightweight approach to British culture, but obviously we're going through some challenging times at the moment with Brexit. You know, we've made a decision we'd rather be on our own than part of something bigger, and perhaps that's in part at least to do with the island culture. It's a very crowded country. I think I just looked up before we started, and we have 268 people per square kilometre, and a lot more here in London. So again, perhaps a slight rationale, at least for our reserved nature. We have to protect our space because we don't have very much. We like to protect our space and our time, keep ourselves to ourselves a little bit more than perhaps where you're from, and that might be a reason why. And again, yes, we have a lot of weather. I won't say any more about the weather. It's very multicultural. I think probably every nationality worldwide is represented here in the UK, probably here in London. And I read that something like 300 world languages are spoken in British schools. So that gives you an idea of the diversity, the multiculturalism of this small island. And something I really like about living here, particularly in London, is the way we have our traditions, we have our monarchy, the very old habits, the cups of tea. I think you mentioned the Morris dancing, but it's actually a very innovative culture as well. We've seen the new architecture in London. We have a higher than average number of startup businesses in the UK, I think, and it's bureaucratically, it's much easier than in other parts of the world to start a new business from scratch. So we find a lot of people from outside as well as inside come here to set up their own businesses. So just a quick word about this. As I said a few minutes ago, I think it's dangerous to see the UK as a homogeneous culture. And it's interesting, we even have different names for our country. Obviously, the United Kingdom is the political name, that's the legal name of the country, but geographically you'll see people talk about Great Britain or the British Isles as well. We're divided into 4 sub-countries, subcultures. So as you know, we have England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. There's a big north-south divide in our country, as in probably many of the other countries where you're all based. And I think London is seen very differently from the rest of the country. Do you know this expression, the metropolitan elite? Certainly those of you who are based here will. Does that mean anything to those of you from outside the UK? No? Yes. Someone's having a stab. Ah, you have the same expression in the Netherlands, okay. So the metropolitan elite is particularly true in London and places like Notting Hill and Islington. People who have money, who are well educated, often quite left-leaning in their political views. And I think this is interesting where it comes to looking at the Brexit vote. It was very much London and Scotland voted to remain, and some of the more regional areas, Ireland, Wales, most of the north of England, most of the southwest of England voted to leave. And I think it really, like I say, I don't want to talk too much about this, but it does highlight the differences within the culture and the fact that it's changing. And I think it would be interesting to run this webinar again in a couple of years and see how the culture has changed. But let's move on for the moment. So again, a question for you. I'm going to share with you what I think our core values are, what makes us tick, what are the things that are important to the British. But perhaps I can ask you first, just to give me some ideas. What's important to the British people that you know? Either use the chat function again or feel free to jot some ideas down on the slide for me. Queuing in an orderly manner, absolutely. So family as well, tradition, conversation rituals, nice. There's a very good book, if you haven't seen it before, by someone called Kate Fox, who's a social anthropologist, and she has spent many hours observing the British in their queues, in their social interactions, and she's written a very funny but very astute analysis of British conventions. So fair play, traditions, protect personal space, lovely. Oh, bravery, that's interesting. The Queen, I don't know if that's a value, but it certainly has, the monarchy has a big impact on our culture. History, football, tea, honour. So we've got some quite abstract concepts as well as some very tangible things. Then on the slide, modesty, I definitely agree with. Helping, that's interesting. And I think sometimes our values are very much human values, but then there are times when one culture values something more than another. So I think we need to be aware that certain values are fairly universal and others are perhaps more specific to different cultural groups, whether that's nationality, religion, ethnicity, gender, and so on. So let me just share some of my ideas with you. So yes, I think someone mentioned this sense of fair play, doing what's right, being correct. And yes, we do like to protect our space and also our privacy. If you are invited to someone's home, I think you should see that as quite an honour. We're not quick to invite people. We do, but it takes some time. Modesty, politeness. And I think politeness also, this means many things in many cultures. And I always hesitate when people say, oh, the British are so polite. Does that mean that other people aren't? For me, I think it's more the way we display our politeness. So in the UK, using things like please and thank you are really important. They're very silly words, very simple words rather, but they do make a difference. Yeah, Martin, I agree completely. We can be pretty impolite. And it's interesting, a year or so ago, I was doing a lot of work with expats coming in from all over the world to work with their organisations for a couple of years. And after I was running these workshops for a couple of months, I realised that there was a theme coming out and people were actually very politely saying how they found the British to be quite passive aggressive. So perhaps we don't necessarily raise our lack of politeness in an overt way, but it's there just the same. Saying sorry a lot, yes, absolutely. Yes, and some of the British swear words are pretty epic is one way of putting it. Thank you, Cecilia. So we're quite independent. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work of Hofstede, one of the cultural gurus, if you like, who's done a lot of research on how national cultures differ. And according to his research, the UK ranks very, very high in terms of individualism. So when this comes to the workplace, we work in teams, we enjoy our colleagues, but we really like to work as individuals. We like to have our own targets. We like to know what we're doing. We like to have clear personal objectives compared to perhaps people in other parts of the world. Privacy, that's come up again. Tradition and history, to a certain extent, yes, and I think that's very visible. So a lot of you mentioned our traditions, our history, and perhaps that's because you see it. Some of these other things I think are less tangible, perhaps more below the surface and harder to observe sometimes. And I spoke a little bit before about the contrast between the traditional and the innovation. And I like to think we still are a tolerant society. Again, we've seen some examples in the last 6 months, the last year, where hopefully this isn't changing too much, but it's something, like I say, I've been doing these sessions for quite a long time, and I hesitated to keep this value in, but I would like to keep it in for the time being. And then our sense of humour, our irony. I think a lot of you have mentioned humour in the chat. And I think one of the things that can be challenging about British humour is it can be hard to know when we're joking. I've found over the years I've introduced many of my international friends to my father, and he will joke with them, but he never smiles. And they don't know that he's joking. And it can be quite stressful as a non-native speaker of English to know if someone's having a joke with you or not. So it's quite hard to find those other signals, but there are signs that you can know that someone's joking with you. And just some proverbs and some sort of traditional things to share with you. I think an English man's home is his castle really highlights this need for space and privacy. I love this by John Major, a previous British Prime Minister. We have this sense of self-deprecation. We like to put ourselves down and laugh at ourselves. We don't like to blow our own trumpets, if you know that expression. We don't shout about our successes. So we like to downplay what we've done. And then again, I really like this one by Julian Barnes, a British novelist and author, who talks about the UK as the land of embarrassment and breakfast. And in a little while, I'll talk a little bit about our sense of awkwardness, which is quite prevalent here as well. But I just really wanted to bring this back now to the work context. And before I go through that slide, I'm just going to ask you to vote a little bit. So you should be able to see a poll here, and you can tick as many of these as are as applicable to you. So it's not just one. You might tick all of them, for example, or none of them potentially. Lovely, thank you. I think things have stopped moving now. So let me just share the results with you. So you should now be able to see that we have quite a few people who are actually based here in the UK. A couple of people are about to move here. A few of you travel here on business. A lot of you have colleagues in the UK. Also clients and partners, and nearly half of you have a British manager, so that will be interesting when we talk about the British management style. So thank you for doing that. Can I just ask you, perhaps you could raise your hand if you have no connection, no interaction with the UK at all. So there are a few of you who perhaps are here for interest or know that in the future you might be interacting a little bit more with the UK. So hopefully it'll be useful for the future, if not for now. Lovely, thank you. So let's have a look at the British workplace. The first thing I wanted to talk about is our management style. And obviously I could spend an hour talking about this, and we're going to cover these things fairly quickly. Those of you who said, yes, I have a British manager, How would you describe their style? Could you perhaps put something in the chat for me? While you're writing, perhaps just to go through the points I've covered on the screen, I think compared to other parts of the world, our style typically, and obviously there are always exceptions, is fairly informal. So we don't tend to act like the boss, perhaps in the same way as other parts of the world. I often have interns here from overseas working with me and my team, and I've had certainly people from the States who've wanted to call me by my title and surname, or I think I had someone once wanting to call me Mom, and I found that very uncomfortable because while we are very traditional, we're actually quite an egalitarian culture, so we don't like that distance between the levels. The other thing I would say is that we expect and we value people who work autonomously, who take ownership, who plan their own structure, that don't need hand-holding. We will, of course, have what we call micromanagers. They exist all around the world, but typically we have quite a hands-off management style. So we expect people to find their own solutions, answer their own problems. We have now, and I think in many parts of the world as well, much more of a concept of manager as coach. So the manager's there to guide, to support, rather than to direct and to lead. Let's just have a look at some of the things that you've put here. So meritocratic, nice. Yes, indirect, absolutely. More wordy than need to be. Always asking instead of telling. Yes, I think that's that coaching style I mentioned. So I won't tell you what to do, Monica. I'll try and tease the answers from you and get you to work out what you need to do yourself. So if you're used to a very directive style, this can be quite challenging. So Wendy said, in the 90s, things were very formal, Mr. and Mrs. Gosh, that surprises me in the 90s. But I guess it does also depend on the organizational culture as well as the national culture. In some sectors, some businesses will have a more formal approach. Retail, okay, that's interesting. Okay, lovely. So let's talk about relationship building a little bit. So I think, again, it depends where you're starting from, which way around the world you're looking. Again, I've had people that complain about how much small talk is necessary here in the UK, but I've worked with other clients who've said there is no small talk. So these are always very relative concepts, but I would say we tick the small talk box. So we do a little bit. We'll ask you how your journey was, talk about the weather, any plans for the weekend, and then we get down to business pretty quickly. So a little bit, but not too much. We don't like very personal questions. So certainly we don't talk about things like money, sort of personal lives. It takes time. We like to talk about our children and our families, but it takes a little bit of time for us to share personal information. It's quite interesting. We've been doing some work as an organization with some trainers, and they ask us every time we have to share some personal good news at the beginning of our training session. And we're a room full of British people, and we all sit there very uncomfortable at the thought of having to talk about ourselves that's not something to do with the business. So I think it's interesting how slowly we find that we share our information. So be patient. We do want to build a relationship with you. It perhaps takes a little bit more time than in Latin America or the Mediterranean countries, for example. Does anyone know what I mean by this coconut? The British, they say, are more like a coconut than a peach. Does that mean anything to anyone? Someone's typing, so hard to crack, exactly. But it's a little bit of a cliche, but once you crack that hard exterior, it's very nice and soft inside. So I think when you build a relationship with your British colleagues, it will be a long-lasting one, but it does take a while to crack that tough exterior. Meetings. Now, what can I say about meetings here in the UK? We complain about them all the time, but we have an awful lot of meetings, I think, compared to other parts of the world. I remember an Australian course participant saying to me a year or so ago, I can't believe it, in this country you even have meetings to prepare for your meetings. So that gives you an idea of the number of meetings we have. I think there's a bit of a myth around the British punctuality, and my experience now is that people generally arrive just in time rather than on time. So if you're organising a meeting or a conference call like this, you might find that people are arriving as it's starting rather than that sort of 10, 15 minutes beforehand that you might expect. But if you're meeting a potential client, it's very important that you arrive on time. I would say aim to be at your client's office perhaps a good 10 minutes beforehand. If you're going to be late, let them know in advance. More reluctant to cancel meetings when not critical or to That's interesting, Monica. Yes, I would agree with that. We often invite the world to our meetings when actually we could have probably a more effective meeting with just a couple of people. Humour, as in all elements of British life, is essential. We do use humour in the workplace, and it's often a good way to break the ice when you meet a client or a partner for the first time, and certainly to get the meeting going. We're fairly structured, but we do, dare I say it, we do go off topic, and we do tend to deviate perhaps from the agenda, but we do have an agenda. And again, organisations vary, but I would say typically in the UK, a meeting serves to agree actions, to make decisions. Obviously, it's not always the case, but our meetings aim to have outcomes. So the final area here I wanted to talk about was the question of work-life balance. You know, in some cultures, they might say, well, we live to work, and in others, we work to live. Which do you think would be more true in the UK? Do we live to work, or do we work to live? Work to live? Work to live? What do the British people on the call think? Yeah, of course. And it's a very personal thing as well, so it does always depend. Work to live until you pass 40, and then everything changes. Work to live, but live to work in a dream place. Okay, nice. So I think most people would say we work to live, but I think we are I would say we're probably more of a live to work culture. But again, it does depend on the sector, the organisation, the context as well. But there is a very clear separation between our personal lives and our professional lives, probably less so in London, where people socialise a lot more with their colleagues and their clients. But in the smaller cities and towns, people tend to go to work, and then they go home and start their personal lives. There is a long hours culture here, and it's interesting. I think most countries and cultures will say that their country has the longest working hours, and certainly I've seen a lot of things that suggest that the UK has longer than average working hours. And we certainly, like probably most of you, we do take work home at the weekends and the evenings. But I think in British organisations' favour, there's a lot more focus now on flexible working. And the days of kind of having to be present, I think, are disappearing. Obviously, it depends on the role. If you're working in a retail sector, for example, you need to be where your clients are. But certainly a lot of our clients here in the UK, they're often working from home, they're working remotely, and that's much, much more acceptable nowadays. I think linking back to the piece on the management styles about results over processes, most British managers want you to get the work done, get the results, and they don't necessarily mind where you do that. They don't need to see you, they need to see your results. Does that all make sense? Does anyone have any questions or comments before we move on? Okay, so let's have a think about British communication styles. I'm going to first of all just share with you a number of elements of any kind of communication. And then I'll ask you a couple of questions. So communication, let's forget about the words we use, the language we speak, and just think about some of the more universal elements. So different cultures communicate in less or more informal styles. We have different levels of direct or indirectness. Our tone of voice can vary enormously. I think somewhere like Italy, for example, is a very kind of up and down intonation. Perhaps places more sort of to the east of Europe, it's more on a level. I think in the UK, we're fairly kind of in the middle there. How much personal space we like between the person we're communicating with, the gestures we use. I tend to use a lot of gestures. You might occasionally see my hands coming up, but on the screen you don't see that quite so much. The eye contact we make. It's quite challenging for me delivering these kind of webinars because I can't make eye contact with you. You can see me, but I have no idea what gestures you're making, what your facial expression is like. Whether we touch when we're talking. How comfortable are we with being interrupted? Do we like to interrupt others? And conversely, how comfortable are we with silence? I would say in the West, and particularly here in the UK, we're not that comfortable with silence. We like to fill the gaps. If I'm talking here, I'll keep talking rather than giving you time to think or to write perhaps as much as I could do or should do. And then how often do we use humour in our communication? So these are kind of universal to various degrees. But what I'd like you to do, certainly those of you who aren't British, is to make a mark against the ones that you find most different in comparison with your own culture. Perhaps if you are British, you can mark the ones that you think make us different in our communication style. What makes British communication the way it is? Or put some comments in the chat otherwise. So pretty much everything. So let's just quickly go through some of these at least, because it looks like we've got pretty much everything apart from tone of voice, eye contact and silence. So people that marked levels of formality or informality, is that because you find that we're more or less formal or informal than you are? More formal in business writing. Okay, more formal. Interesting. We'll look at a couple of emails in a moment so we can have a think about that. You see, I think, and again, this is when we don't always see our own culture as others see us, but I would say we're fairly relaxed in our communication style in terms of formality, but maybe that's my misconception as a Brit myself. What about the directness? Is it that we're more or less direct? That's interesting, Monica. So the Brits use lots of clauses. I think, and that's interesting, I think as well. Someone said about the more grammar you use, the more distance there is. And I know when we tend to use a lot of conditionals in our writing. So could you, would you, might you, may you? And I guess that does create a distance, which creates formality. So yes, I see that. So we're less direct. Yes, less direct compared to us Dutch. And we'll have a look at this in a minute. But yes, we use a lot of kind of words like quite, a little bit, slightly. Lovely. Okay, personal space. I think we've talked about this already. We like a fair amount of personal space. We don't like people to... Someone said to me, it's like we have our own... I don't know if you can see my arms. We have our own boat. And it's about this much space. So we like a good couple of feet between us and our counterpart. Otherwise, we get quite uncomfortable. Gesture, a few of you have marked that one. Can anyone give me any examples? And perhaps those of you who've mentioned touch as well, I'd be interested to hear your comments there. So I think, Monica, that's a less demonstrative with body language. Yes, I would say compared to certainly the Latin cultures, we're a lot less demonstrative and a lot less comfortable with touch as well. I probably wouldn't touch your British partners until you know them very well. We're going to talk in a minute about our kind of sense of awkwardness, and we have a little bit of confusion now about whether we shake hands or give kisses with our colleagues that we know well. But I would say, if in doubt, it's always better to shake hands when you're meeting someone for the first time. Comfort with interruption. Is that we are comfortable or we're not comfortable? Uncomfortable. Okay. Yes, I'm inclined to agree. There's sometimes a slight overlap, particularly if we're with colleagues that we know well, but we're fairly structured in our turn taking. So typically I would wait until you've finished what you're saying before I jump in with my comments. I think it's changing a little bit, but like I say, we are fairly good, if I can say that, about taking turns in conversation. Anyone have any comments on humour? We could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I can see a few of you have circled that. Very subtle. Witty. I think we have a lot of wordplay, so a lot of our humour is around plays on words, different meanings. Like I say, we don't always smile. We're quite ironic, so it can be quite hard to interpret. And yes, we use a lot of cultural context in our humour. One of the things I hear time and time again is how indirect we are and how hard it is to know what we really mean, because we don't tend to like confrontation. Excuse me. Perhaps have a go to pick a couple and see if you can have a guess at what the person really means when they say these things. So, for example, let's have a look at the first one together. I hear what you're saying. That might mean I completely disagree with you. So if I can ask you, perhaps with, like I say, 2 or 3 of the other examples, give me your translation. What does the speaker mean when they say these things? I'll just give you a second to do that. We've got lots of ideas coming through. Yes, I remember I had a boss many years ago, and whenever they came to my desk and said, "Do you have a second?" I knew it was something urgent, serious, and probably bad news. So I really need you now. That's quite an interesting idea. So, not a great idea. I think you should probably start again. That's a nice one as well. Do you have a second? I need an hour of your time. We tend to minimize the negative when we communicate. Can I make a suggestion? So I have a completely different idea. This is what I think you should do, is often the meaning. That's one way of looking at it, but actually it's not my way. I've got a completely different idea. It's fine, really. You'll hear this a lot in British offices. And it probably means it's really not fine. Leave me alone. I'm very upset about this, but not fine. Give it a bit more thought. Start it again. Absolutely. With all due respect, you're completely wrong. I completely disagree. And then do we say something's excellent? Or do we say it's not bad at all? What's the difference in meaning? We don't tend to use these kind of absolute adjectives in the same way that perhaps they do in American English or Australian English even. So if something's positive, we're probably more likely to say that's not bad at all, rather than, wow, that's excellent. We tend to underplay our emotions much more, so hence this indirect style. Yeah, that's nice, Victoria. Thank you. Can we look at this again? Probably means you look at it again. So It doesn't mean that you can't never take these at face value, but often you need to just read the body language, think about what you know about the person, and try and read the subtext. We talk about cracking the British code of communication. So, what's really going on behind that politeness? Sometimes there's quite a subtext that you need to work on to interpret, and that can be one of the hardest things, I think. So I will leave that with you to explore and investigate. Yeah, I think we'll move on now and look at a couple of examples of emails. So just have a read through of this first email on the left. Let me ask a question purely to the British people in the room on the session. How would you respond if you received this email? And I'll ask a slightly different question to the non-British people. What do you think about this email? Is it well written? Is there anything challenging, anything negative about this message? Missing the conditionals, a little bit harsh. Okay, interesting. Someone says it's ironic. That's interesting. Interesting, Nicole. It looks perfectly normal. So I received this email, I don't know, a while back, and I remember feeling quite unhappy when I received it because I found it quite rude. And then I kind of had a conversation with myself and thought, it's not rude at all. She's trying to help me fix a problem. I didn't send the attachment. That's my fault, not hers. But my initial reaction was, how rude. That's so direct. It's so to the point. And I think it's interesting that a few of you have kind of said it's indirect, but for some of you, it's quite natural. It's quite normal. It's short. It's to the point. She says what she needs. So I think the reason I share this is there is a need when you're in email contact with your British colleagues or clients that we need to soften the message a little bit sometimes, so we don't tend to tell it like it is, perhaps to quite the same extent. So why does she ask whether there was one? I think she was trying to be polite, to be fair, but somehow there was a bit of a mismatch in the communication, a little bit of a clash. Here's another one for you, and this one was written British. Yes, I agree, Monica. It felt like she was pointing out my mistake, but then I had a mistake. I'd made a mistake and she needed the attachment. So how, what should she have said? It's a bit tricky. Have a look at this second one and just share any comments you might have about this one. This was British person to British person. Ouch. What do you mean, Victoria? The first one, I imagine, Victoria, you mean is harsh and direct. And Cecilia, you're saying the second one is soft and gentle. Don't kill the messenger. Yeah. Nice. Now, this is a very British email, this second one, but I think what's the danger with this second email? The message actually isn't very clear because it's so soft and it's so indirect. I don't think the course is going ahead. Put yourself in the shoes of the reader and perhaps she's thinking, well, is it or isn't it? What's happening? So I think as British communicators working internationally, exactly, sometimes we need to be a little bit more direct, a little bit to the point. But for those communicating from outside to a British audience, it's worth noting the softness that perhaps we use and we expect. So hopefully that makes sense and just gives you a little bit of a sense of how we communicate when we email. But just a few tips. I think they're mostly common sense, really. But, we don't want pages of waffle, but it does need to be polite and friendly. So still fairly short and to the point, but some nice soft language perhaps at the beginning and end, and some conditionals, as someone pointed out. Not too direct. But still, tell us what's important first. We're still busy people with not much time, so give us some clarity, most definitely. This is super important. We really need and expect a fairly prompt response to our emails. So if it's been a day or two and you still don't have the answer, just send a holding email to let us know that you're exploring the issue and you will get back to us, and perhaps give us a sense of time when you'll be able to send the information that we've asked for. I think this is fairly universal, but I always include it because I think it's so important. Be careful of who you copy. And again, if you think about our lack of hierarchy, our kind of individual style, there really is no need to copy the world into our emails. If we need to share the information, we will. And again, like I say, these other things are fairly universal in terms of email etiquette. We pretty much always nowadays use first names. If someone's written to you with title and surname, perhaps you reply in kind, but otherwise we're fairly relaxed, I would say, in our communication style. And just some expressions that you might want to use to add to your softener toolkit of how you write your emails to your British colleagues. But I'll leave those with you. I felt I couldn't run a session on British culture without talking about this concept of British awkwardness, and it's quite hard to pin down, but I'm sure the Brits on the session will know exactly what I mean. And those of you who've read Kate Fox's book will know that she talks about this a lot. She even talks about the rules of awkwardness in the UK, well, in England in particular. And if you don't already, if you're Twitter people, this very British problems is great. And maybe this is an indication of British humour as well, because they make me laugh a lot. And I'm not sure if those of you who are not from this country would find them as funny, but they give a sense of situations that we find awkward. So even silly things like having to leave a voicemail for somebody, the idea of going on a team building day, being in a training session and being asked, stand up and tell us all about yourself. That's the moment when the awkwardness really comes out. Having to travel with a colleague that you don't know very well on a 30-minute train journey. Worst situation for many British people. I mean, these are also very tongue-in-cheek. It's not 100% serious, but I think for me, it kind of epitomizes this awkward feeling that a lot of us have. Let's do lunch. Well, why do you mention let's do lunch, Monica? Because I think there's a whole thing about that which has come up in other sessions I've run. Brits aren't necessarily introverts, but I think we have an awkwardness with large groups sometimes. We have an awkwardness about sharing. So it doesn't mean there aren't extroverts, but it's this idea of sharing personal stuff. Someone can be the life and soul of the party, but it doesn't mean they're sharing their innermost secrets. So it's a little bit different from the introvert-extrovert spectrum. Let's do lunch because it results in action. It's interesting because I worked with a Dutch group a few months ago, and they were super frustrated because they found that a lot of their British colleagues would say, let's do lunch. The Dutch person would almost get their diary out and say, great, yes, when are you free? And they realised that it was a bit of an empty invitation and not really meant. So often it's kind of a bit of a filler rather than a real invitation. And again, it's cracking that code, knowing how to read between the lines. So just you might wonder why the images are here, but I think I've mentioned already, we really don't like talking about money. Certainly never ask somebody how much they earn or how much their house cost. This whole awkwardness around whether we kiss, hug, shake hands, smile nervously. We don't have a formal set of greetings. And then you may recognize this guy at the bottom. There was a British comedy series on TV for a long time, not that recently, called The Office. And this was David Brent was the king of awkwardness. So if you can find it online, it gives you a real insight into British humour if you've not already seen that programme. So we're coming towards the end of our session. I did warn you it was going to be a bit of a gallop, but just let me leave you with some top tips, some keys to success, if you like, for working here in the UK. So we've covered a lot of these already. It's fine to be curious and ask questions, but perhaps just remember not to be too personal. Expect a fairly relaxed style. We're perhaps not as formal as you might think, so certainly first names, and a fairly relaxed working style. We're fairly punctual in terms of start and finish times. Don't shout too loud about yourself and your achievements. We're fairly modest. We don't tend to talk about our successes too much. I think this is changing, and particularly with social media in our personal lives, you see a lot more of this. But I think in the business and the working world, we're still fairly modest. Respect people's privacy, whether that's time or space. Yes, show a sense of humour, but also be ready to laugh at yourself. It's a great leveler, humour. It can be difficult across cultures, but when you get it right, it really helps to build the relationships. And this, as I say, learn to crack the communication code. So really look for the subtext, watch the body language to make sure that the words you hear are really the message that's intended. And final thing, please and thank you really do matter. They're very small words, but they tend to mean a lot. So use them. Sorry, I guess, is the other one. We always joke that if someone pushes us, we still say sorry, even when it's the other person's fault. There is one more. Just check. If you don't understand, if you're not sure, ask. If you don't ask the questions, you'll never get the answers. So that kind of brings us to the end of the session. So I've talked a lot. I've talked quite quickly. So if anyone has any questions or comments, please put them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer what I can. And perhaps while people are typing, just a quick word, as we always do, about what's coming next, and then we'll look at the questions. The next webinar is next month, as always, so it's later in the month on the 21st of June, and we'll be looking at skills and attributes for global leadership, so developing a global mindset. Today's been very much a taster of what we do on one of our one-day programs. So if you are about to start working in the UK or you've just moved here, we ran a one-day workshop. It's coming up in a couple of weeks on the 5th of June, or otherwise not till November. We also do an abbreviated version on a Saturday. If you're interested, I can always send more information about that. So that's what's next. Let me look at some of these questions that have come through. So, what did your expat clients need the most to help them settle in the UK? Interesting question. I think it varied according to the nationality. The communication piece was always what came up in the feedback as the most useful. I worked a lot with a German company, and for them it was always about how do we make small talk? How do we build the relationships? Whereas with the Latin clients I worked with, it was more, why aren't people making small talk? So I think it very much depends on the culture, where people are coming from in terms of what they need. How flexible, adaptable to other cultures would you say the average British is? It's a great question, Luciana, but I think it's one that's very hard to generalise on. And I think we talked at the beginning around how diverse the UK is and how many subcultures there are. And I think regardless of what culture you're from, I think a lot of this depends on how much exposure you've had. So I would say, and maybe I'm biased, but I would say perhaps people in London are more flexible, more adaptable. And that's not because there's anything unique about people from London, but it's more because it is a very multicultural city. So perhaps even from childhood, people have had a lot more exposure and they've learned to be adaptable. I don't think this is necessarily an innate quality that we have or a culture specific quality. It's much more about how much you've been able to flex that muscle, if you like, of flexibility. Nicole, no, it's fine to ask what part of town they live in. It's interesting, though. I remember a few years back in London, it would be people would ask what postcode, and that would give a suggestion really of what kind of person you were, or perhaps what kind of price bracket of house you're living in. But no, it's absolutely fine to ask where you live. How willing are the Brits to flex to another culture? I think hopefully, Monica, we answered that with Luciana's question. It was quite a similar one. Eleanor, so that, yeah, I was saying about sometimes when people say at work, oh, let's have lunch or let's do a drink after work, we do genuinely invite people. You know, we are social beings, just as people from most cultures are, but there can be sometimes a little bit of an empty offer. And it's quite honestly, it can be hard to read the signals. So again, it comes down to cracking that code. Sometimes it's just a filler. But ask, if someone says, let's have lunch, say, sure, when's good for you? And if they perhaps don't come back quickly with a date, then probably it was a fairly empty invitation. Let's have a look. Fog in channel, continent cut off. Sorry, Cecilia, I'm not sure the reference there. Fog in channel, continent cut off. Is that a book or something? Forgive my ignorance. I mean, I guess I get the reference in terms of being cut off from the rest of Europe. Ah, okay. I mean, it's very topical right now, and I hesitate to say it reflects our culture, but it certainly reflects some of the thinking at the moment. And I'd probably rather not say any more about that for the moment, if that's okay, because it is such a sensitive issue right now. So I think we're almost wrapping up if people don't have any other questions. But as we always say, feel free. I think you have my contact details, but if you don't, contact us at our info address, follow us on any of our social media channels, join our community. And if we don't have any other questions, I'll just say thank you so much as always for joining, and hopefully we'll see some of you at least on the next one, or be in touch by email or on some of our networks, and it'll be great to see you again next time. So thanks again and see you soon. Have a great rest of the day.